Newport, Rhode Island, 1892. A woman takes delivery of the most expensive private residence in American history. $11 million of marble, gold leaf, and imported stone, and uses it roughly 10 weeks a year. That woman had a plan. One specific target. One specific humiliation she needed to engineer. She engineered it. And the woman she humiliated never recovered her position. Then Alva Vanderbilt forced her 18-year-old daughter to marry a British duke the daughter had never chosen, and 300 wedding guests watched the girl cry through the entire ceremony. Then she spent her widowhood trying to dismantle the system that had made her rich enough to do all of it. The house built to defeat one woman became the house where women planned a revolution. This is not a story about marble. It is a story about what a small rectangle of engraved paper can cost, and who pays. Alva Erskine Smith was born in Mobile, Alabama on January 17, 1853, to a man who was standing at the edge of a world that was about to disappear. Murray Forbes Smith was a cotton merchant of the established Southern variety, the kind whose wealth had accrued over decades of plantation-dependent commerce, whose social position was inseparable from the institution that made it possible, and whose entire financial architecture rested on a foundation the Civil War would systematically dismantle. Before the war, Mobile was the second largest cotton exporting port in the country. After it, the ledgers meant nothing. The defeat was not only financial, it was structural. The currency that had denominated Murray Smith's fortune, Confederate bonds, inflated paper, claims against a government that no longer existed, collapsed into worthlessness with the surrender at Appomattox. What followed was the particular slow humiliation of a man watching his social context dissolve around him. The house that had signified something, the name that had carried weight in certain rooms, the future he had assumed was already purchased. Alva was 12 years old when the war ended. She was old enough to understand that the loss was not abstract. The family moved north first, as so many ruined Southerners did, chasing the possibility of reinvention in a city that was allegedly indifferent to origins. New York was not, in fact, indifferent to origins. It had its own hierarchies, its own calcified social registers, its own methods of sorting the acceptable from the merely present. But before Alva could learn that lesson in full, the family moved again. Murray Smith, still attempting to reconstruct something from the wreckage, relocated his household to France. The approximate window is the late 1860s, Alva somewhere between 13 and 16 when she arrived, and the duration is not pinned down with precision, but the effect of those years is not in dispute. She attended school in Paris. She lived in a country that had been producing monumental architecture as a matter of routine for 3 centuries and had long since stopped considering it remarkable. The chateau of the Loire Valley had been standing since the 15th century. Versailles had been under continuous construction, expansion, and embellishment since the reign of Louis XIV. France did not treat its built environment as a luxury. It treated it as a statement about power, about permanence, about who had the right to occupy space in the world. This is the detail that cannot be overstated. Alva was not studying French architecture from engravings in a book. She was walking through it. She was crossing the actual rooms at Versailles, rooms that take longer to traverse than most American buildings took to construct, and absorbing the specific sensory education that only scale can provide. A photograph of the Hall of Mirrors conveys the geometry. Standing inside it conveys the intention. Alva learned the intention. Her father never recovered. The European interlude ended. The family returned to New York, and Murray Forbes Smith spent the remainder of his life in a diminished version of the circumstances he had once commanded. Alva arrived in Manhattan carrying no inherited wealth, no family connections that translated into the city's social currency, and no realistic prospect of conventional advancement. What she carried instead was an architectural vocabulary she had absorbed almost by accident during the years when everything else was being lost, and a particular quality of attention that would prove more durable than money. In April of 1875, she married William Kissam Vanderbilt. The match required no explanation on financial grounds. At the death of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, the self-made patriarch who had converted a Staten Island ferry operation into the dominant railroad network of the American Northeast, in 1877, the family fortune stood at approximately $100 million, making the Vanderbilts, by most serious reckonings, the wealthiest single family in the country. The New York Central Railroad alone generated revenues that dwarfed the gross domestic products of several smaller nations. The checks, in other words, were good. The problem was not the money. The problem was the genealogy. In the stratified social world of Gilded Age New York, where the Knickerbocker families, descendants of Dutch settlers, holders of old Manhattan land grants, bearers of names like Schermerhorn and Van Rensselaer and Livingston, measured respectability in generations rather than bank balances. The Vanderbilt fortune was one generation old. The Commodore had made it. He had been famously rough-mannered, famously indifferent to social polish, famously uninterested in the approval of people whose approval he did not require. His heirs were spending what he had built, furnishing houses and funding marriages and attempting to purchase the social standing that the patriarch had never bothered to want. In the hierarchy that mattered, the one maintained by the woman who had appointed herself its custodian, one generation of railroad wealth was not by itself sufficient. The Vanderbilts were rich. They were not yet acceptable. Alva had married into the fortune. She had also married into the problem. I realize Chapter 1 is running short of the 580 watts minimum. Let me continue it properly. The woman who made that judgment lived at 355th Avenue and held a ball every January. Caroline Webster Schermerhorn had married William Backhouse Astor Jr. and become, by die Seintimi Wester Schermerrians, by the 1870s, the fixed point around which New York society organized itself. She was born in 1830 into the Schermerhorn family, Old Dutch, New York, the kind of name that had been on the same streets for 2 centuries. She did not need to explain herself. She explained other people. The annual January ball at the Astor House was not merely a party, it was a census. If you were on the guest list, you existed in New York society. If you were not, the simplest explanation was that you did not exist. Mrs. Astor did not waste time with nuance. Her instrument was Ward McAllister, a Georgia-born social climber who had reinvented himself as the arbiter of New York taste, and who served Mrs. Astor with the devotion of a man who understood that her power was also his. McAllister told a journalist, reportedly in 1888, that New York society contained only about 400 people worth knowing. The number was not mathematical. It was a door. Mrs. Astor held the key. McAllister managed the lock. The rule that kept the Vanderbilts out was both simple and brutally effective. Social recognition flowed from the established to the newly arrived, not the other direction. The established family received calls from the newcomer. The newcomer waited. If the established family judged the newcomer acceptable, they returned the call. If they did not return it, the newcomer remained invisible, regardless of how many millions sat in their bank account. Mrs. Astor had not called on Alva Vanderbilt. Therefore, Alva Vanderbilt did not exist. $100 million. Invisible. Alva's response was not to petition. She did not work her way up through charity committees or attach herself to a family Mrs. Astor had already approved. She did not wait. She hired an architect. Richard Morris Hunt was the first American to train at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the same French architectural tradition Alva had absorbed as a teenager walking through chateaux she couldn't afford. Hunt had come back from Paris and built a career designing buildings for people who wanted to announce themselves. He charged a percentage of construction costs. The more a client spent, the more he earned. He and Alva were, in this sense, perfectly matched. She told him she wanted a French Renaissance chateau on Fifth Avenue. Construction on the house at 660 Fifth Avenue began around 1879. The avenue in those years was still transitioning. Brownstones, church spires, the occasional more ambitious structure. Alva's chateau did not blend in. It was not designed to blend in. The point of a French Renaissance chateau on Fifth Avenue in 1879 was that it was not a brownstone. It was a declaration that the person inside. It had different reference points than the people on either side. While the house went up, Alva began planning the party. Not a party, the party. A housewarming costume ball for March 26, 1883 that she intended to be the social event of the decade. And she built something into the guest list that Mrs. Astor had not anticipated. Mrs. Astor's daughter, Carrie, wanted to attend. She had been rehearsing a quadrille for weeks, preparing her costume, looking forward to the ball the way young women in that social world looked forward to the events that defined their seasons. Alva let it be known, quietly and precisely, that she could not invite Carrie Astor. The reason was simple. Mrs. Astor had never formally called on Alva. No calling card had arrived at 660 Fifth Avenue. Therefore, Alva had no social relationship with Mrs. Astor, and without that relationship, she could not in good conscience extend an invitation to Mrs. Astor's daughter. Mrs. Astor now had two choices. She could refuse, hold her position, maintain the protocol that said established families did not call first on newcomers, and watch her daughter miss the most talked-about ball in years. Or she could send a calling card to 660 Fifth Avenue. First, before Alva sent one to her, which would mean acknowledging, in the only currency that society recognized, that Alva Vanderbilt existed. The trap was set. Alva waited. Richard Morris Hunt had spent years in Paris, learning how to build things that lasted. He came back to America and found clients who wanted to spend as if nothing would ever end. The house at 660 Fifth Avenue took roughly 3 years to complete, finished around 1882. It was the first French Renaissance chateau on the avenue. Not an interpretation of the style, not a building with French decorative touches, but the actual thing translated in stone to Midtown Manhattan. Hunt understood what Alva was doing. Contemporary accounts suggest he respected her architectural instincts as genuine rather than purely decorative. She was not a client who wanted something impressive and left the decisions to him. She had opinions formed by years of first-hand exposure to the real buildings the chateau was referencing. She knew what a corbel was. She knew what the proportions were supposed to feel like from the inside. Hunt charged a percentage of construction costs. This is worth sitting with for a moment. His fee was not fixed. It grew with the project. Every additional room, every imported stone, every detail Alva insisted on because she had seen the original in France. All of it increased his income. There was no financial incentive for restraint on his side. There was no desire for restraint on hers. The house was not small. While construction finished and the floors were laid and the rooms were furnished, Alva was running a parallel operation. She was managing the guest list for March 26, 1883, with the same precision she had brought to the architectural brief. The list was not just a record of who would attend. It was a mechanism, and the mechanism required Mrs. Astor to move first. The weeks before the ball are not fully documented in ways that let anyone reconstruct the exact conversations. What is documented across multiple accounts is the outcome. Mrs. Astor's calling card arrived at 660 Fifth Avenue, a small rectangle of engraved paper delivered by hand. Caroline Astor's name, pressed into the cardstock, sent to the address of a woman she had spent years pretending did not exist. It meant You exist. Alva sent the invitation. The ball on March 26, 1883 cost an estimated $250,000. Approximately 1,200 guests attended. In 1883, a skilled worker in New York earned roughly $500 a year. The ball cost the equivalent of 500 years of a working person's wages, spent in a single night. The guests came in costume. This was a costume ball, which allowed for a level of spectacle that ordinary evening dress could not support. The press covered it extensively. The New York papers treated it as an event of public significance, which in the particular social economy of Gilded Age New York, it was. Mrs. Astor attended. She was formally received. The Vanderbilts were, from that night, acknowledged. Ward McAllister watched from inside the room he had spent years helping to build. The wall he and Mrs. Astor had maintained, the invisible barrier that kept new money on the outside regardless of its quantity, had come down. Not through petition, through a trap concealed in a guest list, and a house built to make the trap necessary. After 1883, the Vanderbilts were on the right lists. When Ward McAllister published his famous accounting of New York's 400 in February 1892, the Vanderbilts were included. The house at 665th Avenue, the instrument of the whole campaign, was demolished in 1926. A commercial building stands on that block now. No historical marker is reliably documented at the site. The building where Mrs. Astor's calling card arrived, where 1,200 guests danced on the night the wall came down, is gone. But in 1883, the night of the ball, Alva Vanderbilt was 30 years old and had just done something no amount of money, deployed any other way, could have accomplished. She had made the most powerful social gatekeeper in New York send a card to her house. She had been planning the next move for at least 5 years before anyone realized there was a next move. She wanted something bigger than a ballroom on Fifth Avenue. She wanted Versailles, or close enough. The card arrived on a weekday, delivered by hand, bearing no explanation beyond the name engraved at its center, Caroline Astor. A small rectangle of paper, perhaps 3 inches by 2, the kind of object that in another context would mean nothing. In this context, it meant everything. Alva Vanderbilt received it, understood precisely what it represented, and sent the invitation. The trap she had spent 3 years building, the house, the guest list, the carefully circulated information about a quadrille that Carrie Astor had been rehearsing for weeks, had worked exactly as designed. The most powerful woman in New York had blinked first. To understand what the card meant, you have to understand what it cost to send it. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor had spent the better part of 2 decades operating a single, elegant social mechanism. The established family did not call on the arriving family. The arriving family called on them. This was not a written rule. It didn't need to be. It was enforced by consensus, by shared interest, by the quiet agreement of everyone who had already gotten through the door that the door should remain difficult. Sending her card to Alva's address inverted the entire system. Mrs. Astor called on Alva. The woman who decided who existed had, in the language of the calling card, acknowledged that Alva existed first. The ball itself took place on the evening of March the 26th, 1883. Approximately 1,200 guests moved through rooms that Richard Morris Hunt had spent 3 years designing to feel like France. Relocated to the island of Manhattan, French Renaissance stonework, tapestried walls, a ballroom that had no business existing on Fifth Avenue and announced that fact loudly. The press treated the evening as something between a state occasion and a theatrical premiere. New York papers ran detailed accounts of the costumes, the decorations, the sequence of quadrilles performed across the ballroom floor. Correspondents noted who wore what, who stood where, who spoke to whom. The Vanderbilt house had become news. Carrie Astor performed her quadrille. She had rehearsed it by various accounts for the better part of a month, the specific, documented preparation of a young woman who had known for some time that this was the party she needed to attend. Her mother stood in the receiving line and was formally introduced to Alva Vanderbilt. That introduction was the event, not the costumes, not the decorations, not the quadrille. The moment when Caroline Astor extended her hand to Alva Vanderbilt in Alva Vanderbilt's house was the moment 20 years of social architecture came down. The cost of producing that moment was approximately $250,000. A skilled worker in New York City in 1883 earned roughly $500 in a year. The ball consumed the equivalent of 500 years of that wage in a single evening. It bought flowers, lighting, catering, music, and the construction of elaborate set pieces throughout a house that had itself cost years of planning and an architect's sustained creative attention. What it actually purchased was a handshake and a formal introduction. Alva understood the exchange entirely. She had priced the handshake, decided it was worth it, and paid. Ward McAllister was present that evening, the man who had served as Mrs. Astor's social architect, who had reportedly told a journalist there were only about 400 people in New York society, transforming a number into a policy, stood inside the room he had spent years defining and watched the definition change. He did not leave early. Whatever he understood about what the evening meant, he understood it from inside the ballroom, as a guest, which was precisely the position Alva had designed for him. The social gains proved durable. The Vanderbilt name began appearing where it had not appeared before. When McAllister published his accounting of New York's social elect in February of 1892, the famous 400, a list that had the force of a civic document among those who cared about such things, the Vanderbilts were on it. The family that had accumulated $100 million across 2 generations and still couldn't secure an invitation to the right dinner party was now, officially and irreversibly, society. The house that made it possible was demolished in 1926. A commercial building occupies that block of Fifth Avenue now. No confirmed historical marker. The calling card is gone. The ball is gone. The quadrilles are gone. What Alva purchased that night was intangible by design. Social standing cannot be repossessed, cannot be contested in court, cannot be torn down by a developer with a demolition permit, and she had understood this from the beginning. She was already, even as McAllister watched from across the ballroom floor, planning something that no one could reach with a wrecking ball. Newport, Rhode Island, in the 1880s was not a town. It was a competition. The families of Gilded Age New York, the ones who had survived the social gatekeeping of the city's winter season and earned their places on the right lists, decamped each summer to the Rhode Island coast and continued the competition at a larger scale, in buildings they called cottages, with a straightforwardness that approached satire. These were not cottages. They were palaces built on oceanfront lots, staffed by dozens of servants, occupied for 8 to 10 weeks a year, and designed primarily to communicate the wealth and taste of the person who owned them to the people standing outside looking in. Alva understood Newport's grammar completely. She had been reading it for years. Around 1888, construction began on Bellevue Avenue on a property that William K. Vanderbilt was commissioning as a birthday gift for his wife. The architect was Richard Morris Hunt, the same man who had built the Fifth Avenue Chateau, the same man who charged a percentage of construction costs, the same man whose fees grew with every decision Alva made. The model Alva specified was the Petit Trianon at Versailles. This choice was not decorative. It was a statement of exact and deliberate precision. The Petit Trianon was built in the 1760s for Louis XV and became most associated with Marie Antoinette, who used it as her private retreat, a palace within the palace complex of Versailles. built for a queen who wanted a space entirely her own, smaller than the main palace, but finished with an intensity that made square footage irrelevant. To model your Newport summer house on the Petit Trianon was to say something specific, not merely that you had money, but that you had a particular kind of reference point, a particular fluency in the language of royal European power, and a particular willingness to make the comparison explicit. The house took approximately 4 years to complete and was finished around 1892. The final cost came to approximately $11 million. Of that total, roughly $7 million was spent on the marble alone. The stone came from quarries on multiple continents: yellow Sienna marble from Italy, pink Numidian marble from North Africa, white marble from American quarries. Approximately 500,000 cubic feet of it, cut and shipped and fitted together on Bellevue Avenue. $11 million in 1892 translates to somewhere in the range of $380 million today, depending on the inflation measure used. And that figure captures money, but not intention. $7 million. For the stone. Not the structure. Not the gold ballroom with its gilded surfaces and ceiling paintings. Not the furnishings. Not the service wings or the grounds. Just the material that the building was made of. The breakers. Built for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, Alva's brother-in-law, just down Bellevue Avenue. Cost approximately $7 million in total and is the largest of the Newport mansions. Marble House cost $11 million and is considerably smaller. The cost per square foot at Marble House was almost certainly the highest of any private residence built in America during that era. It was not the biggest. It was the most expensive. Those are not the same thing, and Alva knew the difference. Richard Morris Hunt finished Marble House and died on July 31st, 1895, at 67 years old. He never saw what the house became. The house was occupied approximately 10 weeks a year. Alva had the house. The marriage, by 1895, was a different matter. The divorce was filed in 1895. By most accounts, it was Alva who moved first, citing William K. Vanderbilt's adultery, naming the specific transgression in a legal proceeding. In a social world that preferred its transgressions remained decoratively vague. The papers confirmed what New York society had been quietly absorbing for some time, that the Vanderbilt marriage, bebarentations and baron to baronage, whatever it had produced architecturally and dynastically, had not survived the weight of its own ambitions. William K. was not a villain by the standards of his era. He was simply a man who had written the checks while Alva had written the strategy, and at some point the distance between those two activities had become a marriage-ending distance. The social calculus of what this meant was not trivial. In the world Alva had spent 20 years engineering her way into, the world governed by calling cards and guest lists and the particular cruelty of the January ball, divorce was not merely embarrassing. It was categorically destabilizing. A divorced woman occupied a position the social architecture had never been designed to accommodate cleanly. She was no longer a wife. She was not a widow. She had not lost her husband to death, which the world knew how to process, but to a legal proceeding, which it did not. The guest lists had a column for Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt. They had no column for whatever came next. Alva filed the papers anyway. The settlement, as eventually reported and contested, fell somewhere between $10 and $14 million. A figure whose imprecision in the historical record suggests the exact terms were either kept deliberately private or dispersed across instruments complicated enough to resist easy summary. She received custody of the 3 children. She received Marble House. She emerged from the wreckage of a 20-year marriage at 42 years old, in legal possession of a Newport estate that had cost $11 million to build and a personal fortune substantial enough to fund whatever she decided to do next. The social world that was supposed to punish her for the divorce, found itself confronting an awkward arithmetical fact. She could afford not to care. The 3 children she took custody of are worth pausing on because they did not become passive inheritors of a spent dynasty. Consuelo, the eldest, was 18 in 1895 and is the subject of what comes immediately next in this story. William K. Vanderbilt Jr., known as Willie K., would go on to establish the Vanderbilt Cup automobile race in 1904, one of the earliest major racing events in American history, and later financed and built the Vanderbilt Motor Parkway on Long Island, the first road on the continent constructed solely for automobile travel. Harold Sterling Vanderbilt, the youngest, codified the rules of contract bridge in 1925 and won the America's Cup 3 times. The children of the most aggressively social woman in New York became, in sequence, a duchess, a speed enthusiast, and the man who gave cards their modern grammar. Ward McAllister did not live to see what the children became. He died in January of 1895, the same calendar year as the divorce, having devoted the second half of his life to enforcing a social order that had been quietly dissolving since the night Alva's ball defeated Mrs. Astor's protocol in 1883. He had built the wall. He had watched it come down. He spent 12 years writing his memoirs and watching his authority diminish in direct proportion to his attempts to reassert it. His death registered as a minor social footnote in the press that had once treated his pronouncements as civic news. The 400 carried on without their architect. They were already becoming something else. Less than 2 months after Consuelo's wedding, on what is generally recorded as January 11, 1896, Alva married Oliver Hazard, Perry Belmont, a horse racing man, and the son of banker August Belmont Sr. He was 41. She was 42. The marriage had a texture the first one had not. Contemporary accounts describe something closer to genuine companionship. 2 people who had each arrived at a second chapter and found the arrangement mutually agreeable. Oliver kept his Newport estate, Belcourt Castle, designed by Richard Morris Hunt, and constructed between approximately 1891 and 1894 at a cost of around $3 million. He stabled his horses on the ground floor of the main house. Alva moved in and began redecorating. 2 Newport estates, a fortune in her own name, a new husband. The architecture of her life, from this angle, looked like victory. She was 42 years old, solvent, and in legal possession of more marble than most sovereign states could claim. The social conquest that had begun with a calling card in the weeks before March of 1883 was, now, by any measurable standard, complete. She had beaten the wall, furnished the victory in yellow sienna marble, survived the marriage that paid for it, and retained the house when the marriage ended. The story, from the outside, looked finished. But the story of 1895 is not the divorce settlement. It is not the remarriage. It is not Ward McAllister dying quietly in January, with his guest list tucked under his arm. The story of 1895 is November 6th. It is St. Thomas Church, 5th Avenue, New York City. It is a crowd gathering on the sidewalk outside, held back by the occasion's spectacle. It is an 18-year-old girl standing at the threshold of a church, having spent the morning of her wedding day in tears, about to walk toward a man she had not chosen, watched by 300 guests who saw everything and moved for nothing. Consuelo Vanderbilt was born on March 2, 1877. She was 18 years old in 1895, described by everyone who saw her as strikingly beautiful, and she was in love with a man named Winthrop Rutherford, a New York socialite, tall, well-regarded, entirely eligible by any reasonable standard. Not a duke, but eligible. Alva had a different standard. Charles Richard John Spencer Churchill was the 9th Duke of Marlborough. His family seat was Blenheim Palace in Woodstock, Oxfordshire, one of the grandest private houses in England, built in the early 18th century as a gift from the nation to the first Duke for his military victories. Occupying more than 7,000 acres, containing a room called the Long Library that runs 360 feet from end to end. It was also, by the 1890s, in serious financial distress. The Marlborough estate had been hemorrhaging money for decades, and the ninth Duke had inherited a title and a palace that required more income than the title generated. The math was straightforward. He needed an American heiress. Alva needed a duchess for a daughter. The financial arrangement took at least two forms, depending on the source. Some accounts describe a lump sum of approximately $2.5 million. Others describe Vanderbilt railroad stock structured to yield somewhere between $100,000 and $175,000 annually to the Marlborough estate. Possibly both. William K. Vanderbilt, despite the divorce, provided the funds for his daughter's settlement. He was buying his daughter a title. Alva was buying her family a position above anything Mrs. Astor's list could enumerate. The Duchess of Marlborough outranked everyone in the 400. There was no American social category for what Consuelo was about to become. Consuelo wrote about it herself, decades later, in a memoir called The Glitter and the Gold, published in 1953. Her account is precise and not melodramatic, which makes it harder to dismiss. She describes being locked in her room. She describes Alva threatening to shoot Winthrop Rutherford if she refused. She describes Alva telling her that if the marriage did not happen, Alva would suffer a heart attack, and the responsibility would be Consuelo's. These are Consuelo's words, written 58 years after the events, when Alva had been dead for 20 years and could not respond. Alva, while alive, disputed some of the specific characterizations, while generally acknowledging she had pushed the marriage hard. The distance between those two positions is not large. The wedding was on November 6, 1895, at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue. Crowds lined the street outside. The press covered it as a spectacle, a transatlantic alliance, American money meeting English nobility, the kind of match that defined a particular era's understanding of ambition. Inside the church, in front of what multiple accounts describe as roughly 300 guests, Consuelo Vanderbilt wept through the ceremony, visibly, continuously. She wrote later that she had spent the morning of her wedding day in tears. 300 people watched. No one moved. The ninth Duke of Marlborough received his funding. Blenheim Palace received its renovation, including, reportedly, the restoration of the Long Library ceiling. That ceiling still exists. Blenheim Palace is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It receives something in the range of 800,000 visitors per year. Consuelo's dowry is in that ceiling. Her tears paid for something the whole world now walks through. Alva got what she wanted, a title for her daughter, a position that placed the Vanderbilt name above anything a New York ballroom could confer. Consuelo was a duchess. Mrs. Astor, whatever she thought privately, could not outrank that. This is the pivot. Not the house, not the ball, not the calling card. This is where the story of Alva Vanderbilt's ambition stops, being admirable, and starts being something else entirely. The same precision she had brought to a guest list, the same strategic intelligence that had dismantled Mrs. Astor's social monopoly, she brought all of it to bear on an 18-year-old girl who wanted to marry someone she had chosen herself. And she won. She always won. That was the problem. Alva married Oliver Belmont in early 1896 and moved into his world, which was quieter than hers had been. Oliver Belmont was a man who cared genuinely about horse racing and was less interested in social combat than his new wife. Belcourt Castle, his Newport estate on Bellevue Avenue, sat about a mile from Marble House. Richard Morris Hunt, had designed both, which gave Bellevue Avenue in those years the quality of an extended argument about what a summer house should say. Oliver's ground floor was, in fact, stabling for his horses. He had designed the building around their needs. Alva redesigned it around her own. The Belmont years, 1896 to 1908, were not quiet by any ordinary measure, but they were quieter than what had come before. The social wars were largely over. The Vanderbilts were on the lists. Consuelo was a duchess. Ward McAllister was dead. The ballroom at 665th Avenue no longer needed to prove anything. Alva was in her 40s, then her 50s, and the world she had fought to enter was beginning to change around her in ways that no amount of social strategy could address. Consuelo and the 9th Duke of Marlborough separated in 1906, 11 years after the wedding that Consuelo had wept through. The separation was not surprising to anyone who had been paying attention. It was, in its way, the predictable terminus of a transaction. Two people brought together by money and title, rather than choice. Living at Blenheim Palace while Consuelo threw herself into social welfare work in England, running charitable operations and advocating for the rural poor in Oxfordshire. The Duke was present, then absent, then formally separated. The marriage continued on paper while ending in practice. Mrs. Astor, meanwhile, was declining. By the late 1890s and into the first decade of the 20th century, accounts describe her continuing to attend social events, while the cognition that had made her a formidable social force was no longer reliable. She died on October 30th, 1908. She had been born in 1830 and had spent nearly 4 decades as the fixed point around which New York society organized itself. She outlived her own era by at least 15 years, long enough to watch the world she had governed become something she wouldn't have recognized, long enough to have sent that calling card to 665th Avenue and watched what happened next. The calling card was 25 years in the past. The house where it arrived had been the instrument of her defeat. She died having never publicly acknowledged that she'd been outmaneuvered. Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont died on June 10, 1908, 4 months before Mrs. Astor, from complications that some accounts attribute to appendicitis. Alva was 55 years old, a widow for the second time, and now held in her own name a divorce settlement worth somewhere between $10 and $14 million, Marble House on Bellevue Avenue, and Belcourt Castle down the road. 2 Newports. Estates. No husband. A daughter who was a duchess in name only, living apart from a duke in a palace Consuelo's dowry had helped restore. Every person who had defined the previous chapter of Alva's life was gone. William K. Vanderbilt was alive, but remarried, living separately, finished. Richard Morris Hunt had been dead 13 years. Ward McAllister had been dead 13 years. Mrs. Astor was 4 months dead. Oliver was 4 months dead. The social world Alva had stormed was dissolving at the edges as new money, oil money, steel money, fortunes larger than the railroad fortunes, arrived and began the same cycle the Vanderbilts had gone through a generation earlier. Alva was 55. She was solvent. She was done with the game she had been playing. She found a different one. It was not a ballroom. It was a ballot. And she brought to it the same quality she had brought to everything else. She did not petition. She did not ask permission. She built. Marble House in 1909 was $11 million of marble sitting on Bellevue Avenue, owned by a 56-year-old widow who had spent 30 years fighting to be acknowledged by a world she had now largely outlived. The gold ballroom was there. The yellow sienna marble was there. The rooms modeled on the Petit Trianon were there. And Alva Belmont, who had received a divorce settlement worth somewhere between $10 and $14 million, who owned this house outright and the Belcourt Castle down the road, had decided that the most useful thing she could do with all of it was open the doors to the women's suffrage movement. The redeployment was not subtle. The same rooms where Newport society had come to be evaluated, where the right gown and the right name and the right family connection determined whether you would be received or quietly ignored, were now being used to plan campaigns for women who had no vote, no legal standing in most property disputes, and no realistic access to the social machinery that Alva had spent 2 decades mastering. The Gold Ballroom hosted strategy sessions. The grounds hosted public meetings. The Chinese tea house that Alva had built on the property, constructed by some accounts around 1913, though the suffrage meetings at Marble House appear to have begun before that, became a space for the kind of conversation that Newport's established summer residents would have found alarming. Richard Morris Hunt had designed those rooms for a different purpose. He had been dead since July 31st, 1895. Whatever he had imagined Marble House becoming, it was not this. Loop 4 closes here. The architect who built the house died 14 years before the house became what it is actually remembered for. Alva's suffrage work was not polite or peripheral. She became a major financial force in the American women's suffrage movement, working closely with Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party, the more militant wing of the movement, which favored direct action and confrontation over gradual petition. She donated substantial sums, though the exact figures are not fully settled in the historical record. What is documented is the scale of her institutional commitment. She reportedly helped fund the acquisition of a building at 144 Constitution Avenue Northeast in Washington, D.C., which became the National Woman's Party's headquarters. That building, the Sewall Belmont House, still stands. It is now operated as the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument, a name that carries her second married name into federal designation. The woman who had spent $3 million on Newport social infrastructure redirected her fortune toward a federal monument to women's political rights. She also gave speeches. In them, she is recorded as having compared the subjugation of women to enslavement, a comparison that carried a particular charge, given that she had been born in Mobile, Alabama, in 1853, the daughter of a cotton merchant whose pre-war wealth had rested on the labor of enslaved people. Whether she made that connection explicitly in her speeches, or whether it was simply present in the room whenever she made the comparison, the rhetorical move was not uncomplicated. She made it anyway. Contemporaries described her in those years the same way they had always described her: relentless, combative, unwilling to accept that any particular outcome was foreclosed. The women's suffrage movement had been arguing its case, through petitions and legislative campaigns and organized political pressure, for more than 60 years by the time Alva arrived in it. She arrived with money, Newport mansions, and no patience for the pace of progress achieved so far. The question the previous act left open, whether she understood what she had done to Consuelo, was not one she answered directly in public. She was fighting for women's rights, while having, 11 years earlier, treated her own daughter as a negotiating position in a dynastic transaction. That tension sat in the room at every suffrage meeting she hosted. The women planning marches in the Gold Ballroom were advocating for a woman's right to make her own choices. Alva had, 11 years before those meetings, removed that right from the one woman she had the most direct power over. The answer was coming. Consuelo was preparing it. By 1926, Consuelo Vanderbilt had been free of the Marlborough marriage for 5 years on paper and 20 years in practice. She and the 9th Duke had separated in 1906, 11 years after the wedding, the minimum amount of time, perhaps, that two people brought together by a financial transaction rather than affection required to arrive at the formal acknowledgement that the transaction had not produced a marriage. The civil divorce came in 1921. In the same year, the 9th Duke married Gladys Marie Deacon, an American socialite, which is to say he replaced one American woman with another, having required the first one's fortune to stabilize Blenheim Palace, and then required her departure to pursue a second arrangement he apparently preferred. Consuelo, by 1921, had already met Louis-Jacques Balsan, a French aviator and industrialist. She married him after the civil divorce was finalized. She was 44 years old and free. But there was still the matter of the Catholic Church. Consuelo and the Duke had been married in a church ceremony. Under Catholic canon law, a civil divorce did not dissolve a sacramental marriage. For Consuelo to marry Balsan in a church ceremony, and for the Duke, a Catholic, to regularize his own second marriage, the first marriage required annulment. Annulment requires grounds. The grounds Consuelo brought before the Catholic tribunal in 1926 were coercion. She had been forced into the marriage by her mother. She said it plainly. She testified that she had not freely consented to the marriage to the 9th Duke of Marlborough, that her mother had applied pressure, in Consuelo's own account, pressure that included being confined to her room, threats made against Winthrop Rutherford, and Alva's claim that if Consuelo refused, Alva's heart would fail, and Consuelo would bear the responsibility for her death. These are Consuelo's words from her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, published in 1953. The tribunal proceeding came 27 years before the memoir. In 1926, she said it under oath to a church court. The tribunal granted the annulment on grounds of coercion. Alva Belmont, 73 years old, publicly endorsed the testimony. She confirmed what Consuelo had said. The woman who had arranged the marriage, who had spent the years since the wedding fighting for the rights of women to make their own choices, stood before the record of her daughter's testimony and said, "Yes, that is what happened. Not sorry, not an explanation, a confirmation. This is the weight of it." Alva spent 15 years, from 1909 onward, arguing that women deserved autonomy, that the systems which denied women legal standing and political voice were unjust, that the world would be better governed if women had real power. She argued this from inside Marble House, which cost $11 million and was occupied 10 weeks a year. She argued it at the National Woman's Party, which she helped fund with the proceeds of a divorce settlement generated by a marriage that had itself been built on the coercion of her daughter. When the tribunal asked whether Consuelo's account was true, Alva confirmed it. She did not explain why she had done it. She did not offer the word that would have completed the record. The confirmation stands alone in the historical account, clean, unqualified, and unanswered. She had coerced her daughter into a marriage for a title. She spent the following decades fighting for women's freedom. She confirmed the coercion when directly asked. Stand with that for a moment. Those are all the same person. The calling card she received from Mrs. Astor in 1883, the tears running down Consuelo's face at St. Thomas Church in November 1895, the suffragists planning marches in the Gold Ballroom at Marble House, the woman, 73 years old, telling a church tribunal, "Yes, I did that." Same person, same life. William K. Vanderbilt died on July 22, 1920. He had been living in France for much of his later life, a man who had written the checks and found himself largely irrelevant to the story those checks had purchased. The house on Fifth Avenue where the ball had happened was demolished 6 years after his death in 1926, the same year Consuelo testified before the Catholic tribunal. Two events in the same calendar year: the physical erasure of the place where Alva had won her first victory, and the formal legal confirmation of the cost of her last one. Alva spent her final years in Paris, the city where she had gone as a teenager when her father's cotton fortune was gone, where she had walked through the actual scale of the Petit Trianon and filed it away, where she had understood for the first time what money deployed with architectural intelligence could say. She returned to it at the end, as a widow in her 70s who had outlived 2 husbands, 1 social world, and most of the people who had defined the terms of her ambitions. She was still working. The National Woman's Party correspondence from her final years shows an Alva still engaged with organizational politics, still funding, still arguing. The 19th Amendment had passed in 1920, 13 years before her death. Women in America had the right to vote, a right Alva had spent a decade and a substantial portion of her personal fortune fighting for, and she had lived to see it happen. The constitutional fact was accomplished. She moved to Paris. What she did with the remaining 13 years is not reducible to a single narrative. She maintained her connections to the suffrage movement internationally. She continued to fund causes. She was in her 70s and then her 80s, living in a city she had first encountered as a ruined Southern girl whose father owed more than he owned. And she was now, by any conceivable measure, a different kind of person than the one who had arrived. She left instructions for her funeral, not a society funeral. The accounts described National Woman's Party members carrying movement banners. The woman who had engineered the most elaborate society ball of the Gilded Age, 1,200 guests, $250,000, a trap built into a guest list to force the most powerful social gatekeeper in New York to blink first, asked to be buried under suffragist banners rather than any of the social insignia she had spent 30 years accumulating. She died in Paris on January 26, 1933. She was 80 years old, depending on which birth year is correct, and had been alive for the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era, the First World War, women's suffrage, and the beginning of the Great Depression. She had been born into a collapsing world in Mobile, Alabama, and died in the city where the world she had built for herself had begun. Consuelo Vanderbilt Balsan was alive. She would live until December 6, 1964, 31 more years after her mother's death, long enough to see the world change in ways neither of them could have anticipated in the years when a calling card determined who existed and who did not. She wrote her memoir in 1953, measured and precise, when she was 76 years old and had the distance of decades to decide what to say and how to say it. She did not portray herself as purely a victim. She described the social welfare work she had done as Duchess of Marlborough, the charitable organizations, the advocacy for the rural poor in Oxfordshire, as work she had found genuinely meaningful, work she might not have been positioned to do without the title that had cost her so much to carry. The marble at Marble House was still there. The gold ballroom was still there. The $11 million in stone and gilding, modeled room on a palace built for a queen who lost her head, sat on Bellevue Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island, waiting for whoever came next. Marble House is still there. You can drive down Bellevue Avenue in Newport on a Tuesday in October and see it from the road. White marble, French classical, sitting on roughly 2 acres above the Atlantic like something that got lost in transit from Versailles. The Preservation Society of Newport County has owned it since 1963. They charge admission. You buy a ticket and walk through rooms that cost $11 million to build in 1892, which is somewhere in the range of $380 million now, depending on how you calculate it. The gold ballroom is roped off. You look in from the doorway. The walls are covered in carved and gilded bronze. The ceiling is painted. The floor is inlaid. It took 4 years to build this room. Newport Society came here 10 weeks a year, wore the right clothes, said the right things, established who existed and who didn't. Then they went back to New York. Then they came back the next summer. Then the money ran out. The tour guide explains the architecture, the marble types, yellow sienna, pink Numidian, white American, the Petit Trianon reference, Richard Morris Hunt's training at the École des Beaux-Arts. The facts are accurate and the room is extraordinary, and not one of them explains why the woman who built it ended up on the other side of everything it represented. Walk out the back. There is a path down toward the water. At the edge of the property, on a slight rise above the cliff walk, there is a small Chinese-style pavilion, the tea house, built around 1913, 2 decades after the main house, after the divorce, after Consuelo's wedding, after Oliver Belmont's death. Alva had it constructed after she became a widow for the second time. She held suffrage strategy sessions there. A placard explains this. It says the property was used for women's suffrage organizing. It says Alva Belmont was a major financier of the movement. It does not say she forced her daughter into a transatlantic marriage against the girl's will. It does not say Consuelo wept through the ceremony while 300 guests watched. It does not say that 21 years after that wedding, Alva sat in front of a Catholic tribunal and confirmed the coercion under oath. The placard does one thing at a time. The house at 665th Avenue, the one where Mrs. Astor's calling card arrived in the weeks before March 26, 1883, the one where 1,200 guests came to the most expensive party New York had seen, was demolished in 1926. A commercial building replaced it. There is no marker. You can walk past the address and feel nothing because there is nothing to feel. The house is completely gone. Mrs. Astor died in October 1908. Oliver Belmont died in June 1908. Richard Morris Hunt had been dead since 1895. William K. Vanderbilt died in July 1920. Alva died in Paris in January 1933, at 80 years old, having spent her final years in the country where she first learned to read a building. She left instructions, not a society funeral, a suffragist funeral. Members of the National Woman's Party carried banners over her coffin. The woman who built Marble House to establish herself at the top of New York society was buried under the colors of the movement that wanted to dismantle what that society had been built on. The 19th Amendment had passed in 1920, 13 years before she died. She got to see it. Consuelo outlasted everyone. She divorced the Duke in 1921, married the French aviator Louis-Jacques Balsan, wrote her memoir in 1953, and died in December 1964 at 87 years old. She got the annulment. She got the second marriage. She got the last word. Blenheim Palace, the Marlborough family seat that Consuelo's dowry helped restore, the building her suffering paid for, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site now. Approximately 800,000 people visit it every year. They walk through the long library. They take photographs. They do not know her name. Marble House is still open, still white, still there on Bellevue Avenue, still facing the Atlantic, still costing the price of a museum ticket to enter. It was built to send one message to one woman who has been dead for over 100 years. The Marble is not. If you've been to Marble, House, or Blenheim, I want to hear about it in the comments, sources, and further reading in the description.